Welcome to Drive Time Dystopia, where the future is broken, the system is watching, and survival always comes at a cost. Here you'll find dystopian worlds, fractured societies, impossible choices, and the people forced to endure them. So settle in, keep your eyes on the road if you're driving, and step into the dark. Your story begins now.
The world cut in half. Jack Stevens woke before the wall glass finished brightening. Dawn came gently in his city, not like a struggle against darkness, but like a civic kindness, light lifting itself in measured warmth across towers, rooftop gardens, and silent transit lanes braided through green terraces above the lake. From the 41st floor, Geneva looked less built than tuned. The mountains stood beyond it in dark and snow, the water below holding the first gold of morning in a stillness so precise it sometimes made the horizon seem rendered rather than real. Jack stood barefoot at the glass with a warm cup in his hand and watched the city wake. People moved in patient streams along pedestrian spans and garden lifts. Trains glided without noise. No public screens shouted. No sirens cut the air. No visible police watched intersections because there was almost never any need. The old world had once needed noise to prove it was alive. This one had learned that peace did not have to announce itself. He should have loved mornings like this without reservation. Most people did. Most people in Jack's world had been raised to understand this kind of order, not as a miracle, but as a baseline. The natural condition of a civilization mature enough to stop devouring itself for sport. And yet, every now and then, usually in the first thin minutes after waking and before the day arranged his thoughts into their usual shapes, he would feel a hesitation he could not name. The city was beautiful. The institutions were humane. Energy was cheap, food abundant, medicine predictive, conflict rates lower than any century before it. Violence so rare that when it happened, entire regions seemed to breathe in shock. And still, there were moments when Jack looked out at all that polished mercy and felt something like unease with how frictionless everything had become. On the train to the Collider campus, the window dimmed itself against the rising sun, and his reflection bloomed over the city beyond the glass. He glanced at it, then looked back. For one fraction of a second, before the train curved and the image broke, he could have sworn the face looking back carried an expression he had not made. It was harder than his own, tighter, worn by a pressure Jack could not imagine surviving for long. Then the reflection dissolved and Geneva returned, luminous and calm and apparently incapable of containing such a face. By the time the train reached the research corridor feeding toward the Collider, he had already begun explaining it away. Poor sleep, residual dream logic, the brain's old appetite for shadows in clear places. Stephen Jacks woke to the warning tone before the room lights came up. The sound entered first through the speaker mesh above the bed, then through the concrete, then through him. A woman's voice followed, flat and exact as poured metal. Morning compliance window now open. All residents report status. Failure to verify will result in locational flagging. He lay still for half a breath, feeling the ceiling sweat cold into the room, then pushed himself upright and held his wrist beneath the wall scanner until it pulsed green. The ration terminal beside the sink unlocked with a click and dispensed the day's allotment onto a tray. One sealed nutrition brick, one salt packet, one stimulant strip. He set the strip on his tongue and crossed to the slit of reinforced glass that served as his window. Geneva was out there too. Not the same city, he would have said if asked, but the longer he stared, the more the shared skeleton betrayed itself. The lake remained under the haze. The mountains still ringed the basin, though the lower slopes had been cut with monitoring towers and weather cannons and habitation grids. Transit still threaded the air, but in armored sections and controlled convoys. Public terraces had long ago been enclosed into control corridors lined with compliance posts and direction screens repeating the day's priorities. Order is mercy, deviation is violence, prediction is peace. The slogans moved soundlessly across glass the size of buildings. Stephen, dressed in gray utility fabric, clipped his identification band to his throat seam and stepped into the corridor with the other residents of Block 8. Nobody spoke before the first checkpoint. Nobody spoke at the second. The train that took him beneath the western shield wall rattled harder than it should have. Across from him, a woman in state administration trim read revisions from a wrist screen, while above her shoulder, the window reflected the car interior in dirty layers. Stephen caught his own face there and almost missed his stop, because for one impossible instant, the reflection seemed to hesitate, as if another version of him had nearly remained seated and let this whole day continue without him. Then a security drone pivoted overhead, announcing Western Science Corridor, and the moment was gone. Outside the station, the Collider campus rose from the concrete plateau in rings of shielded structures, service towers, heat exchangers, and military berms. In another age, the place might have been called elegant. In this one, it looked like a machine built to discipline the horizon. Jack's morning briefing took place in a glass-walled conference suite overlooking the western service gardens of the Collider. Lavender broke up the geometry outside. Someone had brought apricot pastries from the Commons bakery and set them at the center of the table between projection wands and diagnostic slates. On the far wall, a three-dimensional model of the ring turned slowly in pale blue. Inside the western underside of the model hovered a bright distortion, a knot of impossible geometry nested inside clean probability curves. "We're not calling it a breach," Director Leon said, widening the image with 2 fingers. "Not yet. The current best description remains a localized stress convergence. Media liaison is using tensor event in public language, but internally, the geometry suggests a more stable pressure cusp." Jack looked up from his slate. "A tensor point?" Leon nodded. "Provisionally, yes. If the next run confirms repeatability, the applications could extend well beyond energy density modeling. Materials, transit efficiency, quantum medicine, possibly non-destructive information transfer across otherwise closed systems." Around the table, heads inclined, careful not to overreact before the data warranted it, but excitement moved anyway in small human ways. A systems analyst sat straighter. An ethicist smiled before remembering she was in a briefing. Jack felt the pull of it too. That was the seduction of the place. Each new discovery arrived clothed in the sincere belief that knowledge existed to reduce suffering. Still, as the model rotated and the bright knot at the western access tunnel pulsed larger, Jack found himself staring less at the mathematics than at the label beneath it. Western Access Tunnel/Tensor Point Candidate. He had walked that maintenance corridor dozens of times. Concrete, cable trays, shield ribs, nothing poetic about it. Yet the words made it sound like a pressure line beneath reality itself, a place where the world might admit that its smooth surface was only skin. A question about containment thresholds came from instrumentation. An ethics liaison asked whether cross-domain resonance, if eventually demonstrated, would require new consent frameworks for human-adjacent experimentation. Leon answered with practiced calm. "We are nowhere near crossing anything," she said. "This is observation, not interference. But if the numbers are right, reality may be thinner there than anywhere else." The room went quiet for a second after that, the way rooms do when someone has spoken a sentence too beautiful to belong entirely to procedure. Jack wrote it down almost against his will, Then his slate flashed with an internal security request. Review needed. Corridor image mismatch. He accepted it without thinking. The still frame that opened on his screen showed a grainy service hall lit in maintenance white. At first, he did not understand what he was looking at. Then his own face looked back at him from the far end of the corridor. Not his face exactly. The same structure, same mouth, same brow, but leaner, damaged around the eyes. Standing with the posture of a man who had spent years expecting violence from every doorway. Jack felt something cold pass through him. Problem? Leon asked. He closed the image at once. Probably a tagging error, he said, though his voice no longer sounded like something belonging to a calm world. Stephen's briefing took place 300 meters below the same section of ring inside a reinforced chamber, with no exterior glass and no visible clock. The model above the table was rendered in hard red wireframe. Security personnel stood at each wall. Nobody had brought pastries. Director Viceroy Hallberg did not sit. He circled the projection with his hands clasped behind his back. The event reproduced beyond tolerance, he said. Predictive drift narrowed at the anomaly locus. Civil response modeling from sectors 7 through 12 improved by 4.8% during the surge window. That is not an academic outcome. That is usable leverage. A murmur passed around the table. Stephen kept his face arranged in technical neutrality and studied the wireframe ring. The western underside glowed like a wound. Tensor point stability window flickered above it in block letters. Around the glow, data branches unfolded not just into energy curves or field models, but into social maps, crowd distributions, unrest forecasts. Human behavior laid over particle stress. A mathematician in black gloves said, "If the dimensional layer is penetrable even at low coherence, cross-domain observation becomes actionable. We may be seeing adjacent ethical distributions." Stephen did not move. Adjacent ethical distributions. The kind of phrase the regime liked. Clinical enough to survive conscience. Vague enough to hide the blood inside it. Hallberg stopped beside the model and placed one finger directly through the red glow. "Then the work is simple," he said. "We identify whether alternate societies exist across the event. If they do, we determine which variables produce docility, cohesion, and pre-compliance at scale. If one of those realities contains conditions superior to ours, we acquire them. If it contains threats, we neutralize them before contact becomes mutual." A technician asked about instability risk. Hallberg did not look at him. "Instability," he said, "is merely the transitional cost of higher order." The room said nothing. Stephen glanced at his private workstation feed and saw a folder he had not noticed before, likely exposed by a permissions error during the overnight update. Partition model / ethical divergence. It vanished the next second behind black clearance bars, but not before he saw a pair of mirrored personnel strings flash in the metadata beneath it. One was his own name. The other made his pulse trip. Stevens, Jack. Hallberg was still speaking. If the numbers are right, reality may be thinner there than anywhere else. This time Stephen did move, though only to lower his gaze before anyone could see what had crossed his face. Not fear, recognition. Jack spent the next hour in an internal review suite meant for anomalies too minor for escalation and too strange to leave in normal system queues. He sealed the door, brought the corridor image back up, and felt his stomach go cold all over again. In motion, the figure was worse. The unknown man appeared only for 3 seconds in the western service tunnel before the camera lost him to distortion, but those seconds had a density that made them feel longer. He emerged from a section of corridor that should have been empty, turned once as if listening to something out of frame, and half looked toward the lens. Same jawline, same mouth, same eyes under far less mercy. Jack ran the footage again, slowing it frame by frame. The timestamp stuttered twice around the figure, skipping forward, then briefly backward, as if the system itself had lost its place. He layered thermal. The body heat signature was there, but ghosted, leaving a second faint outline a fraction behind the first. Gait comparison against his own medical records returned an 83% match before flagging insufficient confidence. A chime reminded him he was due for a noon calibration walk at the Western Access Tunnel. He accepted at once. He was not yet frightened in the way his world usually meant frightened. Nothing in his life had trained that reflex cleanly, but something older and harsher was assembling itself under his civic habits, and it told him with unusual clarity that whatever had entered the tunnel wearing his face had not come from a camera mistake. Stephen did not return to his assigned bay after the briefing. He took a maintenance tram 2 sectors past his clearance boundary, walked the length of an underlit service corridor between coolant manifolds, and used an old inspection key to access a secondary diagnostics cage forgotten by the latest software overhaul. The terminal there was obsolete enough to be useful. Half the regime's faith in total visibility rested on the fact that almost no one remembered how much of its infrastructure had been built by tired men improvising during expansion years, leaving doors where later architects saw only walls. Stephen sealed the cage and reopened the hidden directory tree. Partition model/ethical divergence expanded into hundreds of files. He moved fast, copying only what he could understand in motion. Not speculative alternate civics, actual mirrored outcome maps keyed to a reality geometry model that made his head hurt to look at too long. One branch showed population behavior under dominant empathy weighting, another under dominant threat conditioning, another under constrained grief expression, another under authoritarian reinforcement. Civilization rendered not as history, but as adjustable moral pressure. At the center sat tensor point event/partition viability. Stephen opened the logs and forgot to breathe. The machine had not simply detected another layer of matter. It had identified coherent overlap between ethically divergent world states and then begun modeling how traits, institutions, and whole populations might be stabilized on either side of an induced split, as if society itself could be sorted like particles in a field. As if conscience, cruelty, trust, ambition, fear, tenderness, obedience, all the unstable weather of being human, could be separated into cleaner arrangements and made easier to govern once divided. Then he found the personnel mirror tables, names paired across the model with reversal strings and identity probability arcs. Thousands of them. Stephen Jacks matched to Jack Stevens at near total correspondence. Notes attached to certain pairs read, "Subject integrity fracture within acceptable limits. Divergence stress manageable, cross-reality recognition likely under contact conditions." Someone had known. Someone had written these lines knowing they described lives. A floor vibration rolled through the cage as the ring entered pre-run load. Stephen copied what he could to a blind wafer, purged his traces, and killed the screen. Then he did something he had not allowed himself to do in years. He imagined another life in detail. A city with the same bones as his, but not the same soul. A morning without commands. A train reflection that did not harden him. And inside that dangerous picture stood a man whose name had been written backward across his own. The Western Access Tunnel in Jack's world smelled faintly of dust, chilled concrete, and the metal-clean scent of systems so well maintained they had stopped drawing attention to themselves. Jack walked it with 3 others from calibration, and field integrity, each carrying diagnostic slates. The farther they went toward the anomaly locus, the more the place refused its own familiarity. Nothing dramatic. The floor did not shake. The lights did not flicker. But dimensions kept revising themselves by trivial amounts. The next shield rib always looked a little farther away than it should have, until he took 3 steps and found himself under it too soon. Once, glancing down at his slate, the numbers there appeared to belong to a different sequence than the one he had just entered, as though his hands had briefly remembered another task. "Residual phase shimmer," said Anya from field integrity when he slowed. "You feel it most in the tunnel. The brain hates convergences it can't map." At the marked section, they stopped where the monitoring array had been set around the provisional tensor point. Nothing visible occupied the air there, only a mild wrongness that seemed to live more in the act of looking than in space itself, as though the tunnel had been folded inward by a pressure too subtle for crude sight. Jack stood in front of it and felt the hairs rise on his arms. Environmental irregularities rolled across his slate faster than the system could smooth them into ordinary language. Time phase jitter, minor thermal lag, reflective incoherence, acoustic offset. He lifted his head and for one dislocating instant, thought someone was standing on the other side of the distortion, not facing him, but turned away in profile. A man in a darker corridor, shoulders tight, listening to some distant alarm. The vision vanished. "Did you see that?" Jack asked too quickly. "See what?" Anya said. He almost said my own face in a place that should not exist, but shame stopped him. Instead, he crouched by the floor sensors and noticed a fresh scrape on the concrete near the wall, the kind of mark made by a boot sole dragged sideways under sudden force. The tread pattern was unfamiliar, heavy and segmented, closer to old industrial security issue than anything used on this campus. Later, when the others were 2 ribs ahead discussing recalibration, Jack glanced back toward the distortion and saw the transparent air bend just enough to return his reflection from the opposite service panel. But the face staring back was not his. It was the harder one again, and this time the mouth moved before the image failed. Jack could not hear the words. He only knew with impossible certainty that the other man had spoken first. Stephen reached the western underside of his collider through a route maintenance crews used during magnet servicing, a ladder drop followed by a low passage packed with coolant pipes and manual shutoffs. The place smelled of hot dust, wet metal, and old industrial fatigue. Above him, the main complex was already moving into pre-run lockdown. Sirens rose and fell. Bulkhead doors sealed sector by sector. He crouched in the last alcove before the tunnel and patched a stripped fiber lead into a wall service port. Diagnostics spilled over his wrist pad. Tensor stress climbing. Load harmonics approaching event threshold. Dimensional coherence transient but rising. Then another field appeared, visible only because some frightened engineer had forgotten to scrub it. Cross-domain resonance detected. Anthropic signal echo present. Not matter, not background noise. Human pattern resonance across the event. Stephen disconnected the line and stepped into the tunnel just as the lighting shifted from maintenance white to emergency amber. The place looked almost identical to the corridor in the mirror tables, only here the walls were stained darker, the shield ribs thicker, the air dirtier with old heat. At the marked tensor locus, the space above the floor had begun to move wrong. Nothing tore. The corridor itself simply seemed unable to agree on one version of its geometry. The wall strips bent inward, then outward. The far end narrowed and lengthened at once. A voice crackled from the overhead speaker. "Sector H West unauthorized presence detected. Stand where you are." Stephen took another step and saw, impossibly clear for less than a heartbeat, another tunnel laid over his own like a second image on misaligned film. Cleaner concrete, different light, no security posts. And in that other corridor, a man stood looking toward him, with Stephen's own face softened by a life he had never been allowed to live. The shock of it was bodily and total, not amazement. Loss. Boots pounded in the access lane behind him. He did the only thing that made sense to a man whose world had spent years teaching him that cages expanded faster than choices. He ran toward the impossible. In Jack's world, the run failed as he was halfway back to the central lift. He heard it first as a bass note that came not through the tunnel, but through his bones. Anya turned sharply. Someone behind them said, "That's not right," and every slate in the corridor flashed red. Full load instability, field coherence loss, evacuate western access. The lights dropped, surged, and became painfully bright. The air thickened and flexed. It was not like an explosion. It felt as if the corridor had abruptly remembered another shape and was trying to occupy both at once. The distortion at the tensor point swelled from invisible wrongness into a standing pane of bent transparency stretching from wall to wall. Inside it, depth multiplied. Jack could see the ribs of his own tunnel repeating away into impossible distance, but between them ran another corridor entirely, harsher lit and darker lined, alarms strobing along its ceiling. And in that corridor, coming straight toward him at a dead run, was the man from the footage. Same face, same body. A human being under a different life, eyes locked on Jack with the certainty of someone fleeing a fire only he could see. "Down!" someone shouted. Jack did not move. The man in the other tunnel hit the bright center of the distortion, and the surface of the world failed. For one blinding fraction of time, Jack felt a second mind rake past his own, not in language but in impact. Hunger, suspicion, cold mornings, obedient screens, the muscle memory of bracing for harm, and beneath all of it, a savage, wounded astonishment at the existence of kindness. Then the figure broke through. He struck the floor hard, rolled, and came up on one knee with the speed of a man expecting immediate violence. Around them, the lights burst, sensor housings popped from the wall, and every alarm in the corridor began speaking at once. Jack stared at the intruder and saw his own face staring back through damage, hunger, and hate held on a short leash. The other man looked just as stunned, but not for long. He took in the unarmed maintenance staff, the clean tunnel, the absence of tactical response, and something terrible and almost disbelieving crossed his expression. Then he ran. Stephen expected pain first after crossing. That was how every state intervention in his world announced itself, whether in body or mind. Pain, restraint, instruction. Instead, he got cold tile against his palms, the taste of blood where he had bitten his cheek, and hands trying to help him with a gentleness so alien it registered as threat. He came up off the floor on instinct, striking one wrist away before he understood what he was seeing. Two medtechs in pale emergency shells recoiled, not out of training for violence but out of honest surprise, and that startled him more than anything else. Behind them, the tunnel still screamed with overlapping alarms, but the voices issuing from the speakers were wrong. "Please move to the marked safe line. Medical assistance is on the way. Stay calm." Stay calm, as if calm were something a system offered rather than demanded. Stephen's shoulder burned where he had hit the tensor point. He looked beyond the medtechs through the settling white shimmer around the failing seam and saw the face that had met his for that impossible second. His face, softer, less used. watching him now with naked shock and dawning horror. Someone shouted for containment doors. Another voice argued that sealing the corridor under load could destabilize the field further. The disagreement itself hit Stephen like a blow. People here argued in the open. No one seemed afraid of being seen disagreeing. That one fact nearly broke his balance. He bolted before the kindness around him could become analysis. He emerged above ground into a daylight so clean it hurt. The Collider campus had the same broad structure as his, but softened by gardens, sculpture walls, water channels, and broad walkways where people actually paused for one another. Emergency notices rippled softly across public screens, asking for patience during a systems anomaly in the western tunnels. Nobody was herded. Nobody was scanned while moving. A woman in work shells crouched to reassure a frightened child, and no one treated the child's fear as civic contamination. Stephen kept moving because if he stopped for too long, the city would split him open. At the transit station beneath the campus, people discussed the alarm openly. A gray-haired man with gardening tools clipped to his satchel remarked that the emergency protocol had been too quiet this time and would probably be revised after review. A younger woman disagreed and smiled while doing it. Stephen stood 3 feet away, listening as if to banned audio from a vanished civilization. The train arrived without armed escort. No scanner gates closed around it. Inside, the windows held the city in broad, unguarded sweeps. Lake light, terraces full of trees, pedestrian bridges with music nodes, old stone facades integrated into newer construction without being flattened into ideology. He kept spotting the same underlying forms as his own Geneva and recoiling from the moral differences that clothed them. A square that held a sentence tower in his world opened here around a reflecting pool and clustered food stands. Children ran through water jets while 2 elderly men argued amiably over chess. At a public directory under a canopy, the system woke without demanding credentials. "How can I help?" it asked in a neutral voice. For a moment, Stephen nearly tore the screen out of its frame. Then he typed the name from the hidden tables. Jack Stevens. The result appeared immediately. J. Stevens, Systems Analysis, European Civic Collider Cooperative, recent published work in field harmonics and ethical oversight frameworks. Public Residence District. Current contact routing disabled. Ethical oversight. Of course, the better version of him worked in ethics. He memorized the district, backed away from the screen, and only then noticed that his own hands were trembling. Jack, meanwhile, had managed to retain a restricted channel to the incident response grid by arguing that immediate containment of the crossover individual might worsen field instability. It was partly true and useful enough to slow security. When he reviewed the intruder's path across campus, he saw what others had missed. The man had paused at a public wayfinding panel for exactly 2 seconds. Jack pulled the feed. The query entered under no recognized ID was simple. Jack Stevens. Somewhere on campus or already beyond it walked a man who knew his name. Jack took the East Tram into the city before security could decide he was more useful in a command room. On the ride down, he replayed the crossover in impossible fragments. The doubled tunnel, the rushing figure, the impact of another life crashing through his own. Hunger with system edges around it. Suspicion made into posture. The appalling shock of kindness. He began tracing what that would feel like in the streets below. By the time he crossed the upper plaza above the station, his private alert feed was already filling with language that tried and failed to stay gentle. Containment. Radius. Identity instability. Voluntary cooperation encouraged. He silenced the notices and looked up. Across the water basin near a bronze spiral sculpture, a man stood half-turned away from him in worn, dark clothing that matched no city shell or service issue. Jack knew the shoulders before the face turned. Then the face did turn, and the world seemed to step sideways beneath him. Same structure, same eyes. Scar above the brow, this time visible even at distance. Mouth drawn harder. 20 meters separated them across a public square in a city that had never prepared language for such a thing. The other man saw him. Not merely saw him, recognized him. Fury crossed the stranger's expression, then disbelief, then something so wounded it made the hair rise on Jack's arms. A child ran laughing through the basin jets and briefly crossed the sight line. When the spray cleared, the man was moving fast toward the south arcade. Jack went after him. Stephen could have vanished into the tram tunnels or taken a maintenance stair. Instead, he chose a narrower route through the old quarter, a passage lined with shadowed stone where footsteps echoed clear. At the far end, a service court opened behind closed workshops and irrigation drums. He stepped into it, turned, and waited. Jack came through the arch a second later, breathing harder than he wanted to show, and stopped dead at the sight of himself standing there in the half-shade like a consequence finally willing to be seen. For a moment, neither moved. Somewhere overhead, a bell marked the quarter hour. Water clicked in old pipes. "You're real," Jack said at last. Stephen gave a short, humorless nod. "So are you. That's the problem." Jack took another step, palms visible. "I saw you in the tunnel. I saw you first. I don't understand what's happening." "No," Stephen said. "I don't think you do." The cruelty landed, but Jack did not retreat. "Are you hurt?" he asked instead. The question hit Stephen like an insult and a memory at once. "Your people asked the same thing," he said. "In the tunnel. Medics. They tried to help." Jack frowned, genuinely confused by the offense. "Of course they did." Stephen laughed once, ugly and brief. "Exactly." The laugh made Jack understand at least one thing. The difference between them was not cosmetic. It was lived, structural, cut into reflex. "Security is looking for you," Jack said. "I assumed your utopia had some equivalent of teeth. We don't want to hurt you." That's a sentence only someone from your side could say with a straight face. Jack absorbed that and changed tactics. "If they find you before I understand what happened in that tunnel, I lose the only chance I have of knowing what you are." Stephen's gaze sharpened. "You know my name. You searched for me. And I think you came looking because you believed I had something to do with the Collider event." Stephen did not answer. "I'm Jack Stevens," Jack said. "I know," Stephen replied. "What's your name?" Jack asked. Stephen held his gaze another second. "Stephen Jacks." The name slotted into Jack with impossible rightness. "That's not possible," he whispered. "No," Stephen said. "It is. That's why we should both be afraid." Security alerts tightened across the quarter. Jack glanced at his wrist pad and saw the perimeter narrowing. "There's an old archive annex 2 streets over," he said quickly. "Private review rooms, analog stacks, low-foot traffic. If you want answers, we can get them faster together than apart." Stephen looked at the wall, the arch, the bright slice of sky above the court. Offers in his world always carried hooks. In this one, perhaps they carried blind spots instead. "Fine," he said at last. "But if this is a trap—" Jack nodded once. "You'll know before I do." The archive annex sat behind an older civic facade Jack had passed 100 times without really noticing. A modest brass plaque beside the side entrance read, "Public Records / Ethics Review / Historical Media." The door admitted them after scanning Jack's wrist and opened instead of demanding a second verification. Inside, the building smelled of paper, wood oil, dust warmed by low circulation fans, and the faint electronic breath of preservation systems hidden behind walls older than both of them. Jack led Stephen down a side corridor to a private review room with frosted glass panels and a manual deadbolt. Once inside, he sealed the door, dimmed the wall glass to opacity, and sat first with both palms flat on the table. "I'm not calling anyone," he said. Stephen remained standing. "That sentence still assumes I care whether you mean it." Jack accepted the blow. "Then care whether I'm useful." He touched the terminal hub. "You searched for me because you thought I had something to do with the Collider event. You're probably right. I saw you cross. I have partial access to the anomaly logs. And if what happened in the tunnel means what I think it means, both our worlds are already changing." Stephen sat at last, though without relaxing. They compared the security footage, the telemetry, the name tables from Stephen's copied wafer, and the first behavioral disturbances already rippling through Jack's city. A verbal altercation in a food co-op. A child stealing at a transit station. Sudden jealousy in a care network where jealousy had almost never surfaced unmediated. "People here don't do this," Jack said, hating the sentence even as it came out because it sounded proud and foolish. Stephen looked at the list and then at him. "Of course they do. You just built a world that forgot what to call it." They widened the search into early Collider ethics packets, expansion authorizations, buried appendices, and historical drafts whose titles seemed aggressively harmless. Stability Framework Revision, Human Factors Boundary Clarification, Post-Event Social Variance Notes. The deeper they went, the more the language gathered into a structure whose outline neither man wanted to see first. Effective load redistribution under bifurcated field conditions. Ethical asymmetry modeling. Trait clustering. Partition persistence. Social cohesion gain under selective emotional weighting. Every document stopped just short of confession and hid behind mathematics. In the earliest private draft of the Collider's humanitarian charter, Jack found a paragraph later removed from every public version. In cautious speculative language, it raised the possibility that large-scale field harmonics could allow not merely transit or information transfer across adjacent states of reality, but the isolation of destabilizing human variables into separable expressions. "Isolation," Jack said softly. "Expression. Variables." Stephen leaned closer. "Say it properly." Jack swallowed. "People." The deeper they dug, the less it felt like investigation, and the more it felt like recollection wearing the mask of discovery. Jack would open a document he had never seen and somehow know where the crucial paragraph lay. Stephen would cross-reference a clipped term from his wafer against civic archives and find the mirrored phrase waiting there in softer language. One century-old variance graph showed violent crime, coercive domestic incidents, retaliatory public harm, panic clustering, and predatory fraud dropping over a period of months with no gradual civic cause. No war ended. No famine lifted. No governance revolution explained it. The trend line simply bent downward as if some invisible hand had taken part of the species and removed its appetite for certain forms of damage. Beneath the graph sat a single analyst's note never meant for broader circulation. Statistical relief exceeds plausible civic explanation. From Stephen's copied regime summaries came the mirrored brutality of the same truth. Deviance hardening successful. Grief suppression incomplete. Dominance retention favorable. Aggression useful in maintaining order but prone to excess without adaptive conscience balancing. not the language of an ordinary authoritarian state, the language of a system managing a designed condition. Then they opened the paired identity strings. Thousands of names, yes, but some entries were weighted more heavily than others, tracked across more generations of revision. Jack Stevens/Stephen Jacks sat among those with a coherent score so close to total, it made Jack's skin prickle. He clicked into the node. Reciprocal identity divergent stable. Recognition response likelihood high under direct contact. Reintegration risk incalculable pending seam event. Subject memory correspondence partial. One stripped note beneath it read, "Subject bifurcation remains viable under moral load separation assumptions. Projected civic outcomes demonstrate dramatic variance improvement when destabilizing drives are not merely suppressed, but partitioned into persistent adjacent domains." Jack leaned back so abruptly his chair whispered across the floor. "Persistent adjacent domains," he said. "Not discovered, made." Stevens said nothing. Jack opened the linked model beneath the note and saw a sphere divided into two interlocking fields. Trait densities flowed outward into separate chambers. Empathy, curiosity, restraint, grief tolerance, cooperative trust, long-horizon care weighted toward one emergent domain. Aggression, appetite, coercive instinct, dominance reflex, punitive certainty toward the other. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough to create divergence that would self-stabilize over generations if sealed by event coherence. At the center of the split, tensor point-induced partition/trial phase. "They cut us," Jack whispered. Stephen gave the smallest nod. "Not just us." The implication landed everywhere at once. Jack's world had not become humane by defeating darkness. It had become humane by exporting a great deal of that darkness elsewhere, and then forgetting the transfer had ever occurred. Stephen's world had not merely fallen into authoritarian brutality by bad luck. It had been left holding densities of fear, punishment, appetite, and dominance no healthy society could metabolize alone. "You were right," Jack said at last. "Your world isn't the opposite of mine because it failed where mine succeeded. It's carrying what mine refused to keep." Stephen leaned back from the table as though the room's air had grown thin. "Nobody in either world is whole," he said. The truth was confirmed by the present before either of them could retreat into disbelief. Jack's city showed aggression, possession, panic, and intrusive violent ideation radiating outward from the collider district. Stephen's copied feeds and residual mirrored channels showed the inverse in his Geneva. Officers hesitating before striking, civilians crying in public for reasons they could not name. Ration queues dissolving not into riot, but into sharing. Neither world was merely influencing the other. Each was beginning to receive back the denied weather of its own nature, and the return was not gentle. Director Leon finally called Jack directly from a secure command room he had never been authorized to enter. "Security has confirmed multiple unregistered queries tied to your access pattern," she said. "A witness places you with the crossover individual. I am giving you 10 seconds to decide whether this next conversation happens as colleagues or as containment subjects." Jack asked her the only question that mattered. Was the tensor point ever really an accident? Leon did not answer at once. Her silence told him enough. "Leave your current location," she said at last. "Now, both of you." The feed cut. Stephen rose first. "That answers one thing," he said. "They already knew enough to be afraid of us finding out." Jack gathered the mirrored wafer, the copied files, and the black ceramic drive module Leon had later passed to him from a hidden cabinet in the command room. Original partition models, primary event logs. Everything kept off the public record, and most of the private one. "Back to the collider," he said. Stephen met his eyes. "Good, because whatever they cut apart is starting to want itself back." They returned through maintenance stairwells and old service conduits, while both cities convulsed in opposite directions. In Jack's Geneva, public well-being staff tried to talk citizens through emotions their world had taught them to outsource into civics and trust. A man in lab shells whispered that he had wanted to hit a colleague and did not know what that meant about him. Security staff argued at a sealed door about whether they even had the legal basis to reroute civilians by force. In Stephen's Geneva, command structures froze under the pressure of newly rediscovered pity. Neither world was breaking tonight, Stephen told Jack in a concrete corridor under the mountain. It broke a long time ago. Tonight it just lost the script. By the time they reached the West Auxiliary Chamber, the seam had widened into a volume of distorted depth occupying the center of the tunnel and breathing light into the concrete in arrhythmic surges. Inside it, Jack could see his own corridor, Stephen's corridor, an older, harsher construction geometry neither had lived in, and behind all of them a sterile white chamber flickering in and out like a fact reality could not yet hold steady. On Stephen's side, Hallberg's teams had reached the tunnel with portable field units braced on tripods. "He's going to punch the overlap wider," Stephen said. "If he gets a stable lock with both of us in range, he can treat the seam like a bridge." On Jack's side, security entered from a service door, among them Aaron Veith from Campus De-Escalation, restraint module drawn but not armed. "Jack," Veith said, "Director Leon instructed us to prioritize your survival. Step away from the convergence and come with us." Hallberg raised one gloved hand across the seam. Jack's world behind him and Stephen's before him both stood on the edge of something worse than violence. Jack turned to Veith. "You don't understand the risk." "No," Jack said. "You don't understand the crime." The seam swelled again. The white chamber flickered behind all the overlays. Stephen stepped closer until their shoulders nearly touched. "If we do this," he said, "we don't get to choose what survives." Jack looked at him, at Hallberg, at Veith, at the seam breathing an impossible light. "I know," he said. "No," Stephen replied, "you don't. But you're closer now." On Hallberg's side, the field array powered up. On Jack's side, Veith raised his voice in one last plea. The two broken halves of the same man stepped into the widening seam together. There are no clean words for what followed, because step implied ground and sequence, and this was neither. Jack and Stephen moved at the same instant, and the tensor point widened toward them in layered transparencies. One tunnel, the other, the older raw geometry, and behind all of it, the white chamber flickering like a fact. Hallberg's array discharged. Veith shouted something that might have been Jack's name. Then the world opened inward. Pain came first, but not the useful kind. Not injury the mind could locate and organize. It was the pain of too much recognition arriving at once, as if every wall inside identity had been turned to glass and struck from both sides. Jack felt Stephen's childhood without narrative mercy, calibration tones at dawn, the studied deadness of teachers whose affection had been trained into safety-neutral forms, the first time hunger and humiliation braided together strongly enough to become worldview, the skill of reading guard fatigue and blind camera angles because fear had long ago been turned into structure rather than fire. Stephen felt Jack's life breaking across him with equal intimacy. Open light on glass, the luxury of being asked what he thought and assuming the answer might matter. The old civic fiction that goodness was simply what happened when systems matured enough to support it. The streams did not remain separate long enough to compare. They struck, mingled, recoiled, and struck again. Beneath both came an older shared arrangement: appetite and care, violence and remorse, ambition and tenderness, the ordinary contradictory weather of a whole human animal before anyone had dared imagine it could be redistributed into cleaner civic climates. Then came the third memory. Neither lived yet both recognized, because it belonged to them beneath both names. A laboratory under mountain stone, white observation glass, transparent model spheres rotating above a table. A woman saying, "If the partition persists, they won't know what they've lost." A man answering, calm to the point of obscenity, "That is the only reason it will work." A signature line on a project authorization sheet, J.S. Jacks. The initials struck like a blade. Jack felt Stephen feel them too. The white chamber had not been behind the seam. It had always been beneath it, above it, before it, waiting in the architecture of the cut. When the white returned, it returned clean. Jack hit a hard floor on one shoulder and rolled. Stephen struck somewhere close enough that Jack felt the impact through the surface before hearing it. Silence followed, so complete after the alarms and layered voices that silence itself became evidence. The room resolving around them was the one from the flickers: white composite panels, observation strips, glass walls on 3 sides, a 4th wall broken only by a sealed door without handle. They looked at one another, and the resemblance had changed. Not reduced, deepened. Jack could no longer mistake Stephen's hardness for mere brutality. Stephen could no longer mistake Jack's gentleness for weightlessness. Beyond the glass lay a control theater the size of a small lecture hall. Ranks of consoles curved around the chamber. Most were dark. A few glowed with low-status lights, as if power had only just returned or never fully left. Above the consoles hung 3 suspended displays. The center screen rendered first because some part of Jack had already feared the words. Partition trial complete. Beneath it, a second line stabilized. Subject integrity restored. The left display held 2 world state maps, Jack's and Stephen's, rotating side by side. The right display showed a timeline branching back through trial iterations, failed splits, unstable distributions, domain collapses, recalibrations. Some entries were marked terminated, others archived, others persistent. Their worlds were there, not as discoveries, as trial outcomes. And in the far dark, beyond the theater, more chambers extended in rows, some empty, some filled with dormant structures like sealed observation shells, humanity waiting in pieces. A figure stood in the shadows behind the central console bank until at last he stepped into full light. Jack's body reacted before thought caught up. So did Stephen's. The man beyond the glass had their face. Not exactly. Age had refined it, sharpened it. The mouth carried less visible strain than Stephen's and less moral hesitation than Jack's. The eyes were cooler than either, not empty but trained to stand outside feeling and still use its logic. Silver at the temples, the same slight angle of the head when assessing a system. He wore a dark suit with no insignia, as though rank had become unnecessary once one stood close enough to authorship. When he stopped at the console, the screens behind him brightened. Project Lead, Dr. Jonah Stephen Jacks. He regarded them in silence long enough that Jack began to understand the depth of the cruelty involved. This was not reunion. It was study. "You integrated faster than forecast," the man said at last. "That is encouraging." Stephen struck the glass once with the heel of his hand. "You did this." "No," the older man replied. "I solved it." "Solved what?" Jack asked. Dr. Jax looked at him with patient disappointment. Human incoherence. The species was failing under the burden of its own contradiction. Reform, coercion, distribution, restorative models, therapeutic scaling, nothing outpaced the feedback loop between fear and power. Partition was the first framework that produced durable civic divergence. He touched Jack's world on the left display, then Stephen's on the right. One domain optimized for care, trust, and social flourishing. Another for command, appetite, and coercive endurance. Imperfect, of course. No partition is pure, but sufficient for proof. Stephen's voice went cold. You made prisons and called them variables. Dr. Jax did not deny it. I made control conditions. Jack stared at him through the glass and understood the deeper horror. This man did not think himself villain or savior. He thought himself the only adult left in a room full of species-level children. Chamber lights beyond the theater began coming on one by one in the far dark. Now, he said, almost conversationally, we can do it properly. Jack hit the glass hard enough to ring it. Stephen struck it a second later. The man beyond did not flinch. Open the door, Stephen said. If you still believe doors are the important boundary here, Dr. Jack said, the partition held longer than I feared. Then the older memory broke open further. A laboratory, a project team, a woman asking whether partitioning the lead subject first was madness. The same voice answering, it is the only ethical version of the experiment. Stephen felt it too, a beat behind. Dr. Jax nodded once as recognition crossed both their faces. Yes, I was the first partition anchor. No trial this large could be run on civilization without proving survivable bifurcation in a single coherent subject first. I divided myself before I divided the world. You are not my children. You are my continuity problem solved in opposite directions. The displays widened. Active collapse projections for both worlds rose with terrifying speed. Jack's Geneva showed transport delays hardening into territorial disputes, care networks buckling under jealousy and fear, public support workers overwhelmed by emotions they had no inherited grammar to hold. Stephen's Geneva showed command structures stalling as officers froze between obedience and pity, ration systems collapsing because queues kept dissolving into sharing, state discipline turning erratic as grief and tenderness spread through institutions built to call both contamination. Your worlds were stable as partitions, Dr. Jack said. Not as reunions. Two domains were too coarse. Cruelty and mercy do not divide cleanly in halves, nor do appetite, restraint, grief, ambition, fear, care. The first trial proved only that large moral burdens can be separated and made to persist. It did not solve humane distribution. The chamber city beyond them glowed brighter. Jack saw what Phase 2 meant before the display rendered it fully. Not two worlds. Many. One for grief tolerance and communal endurance. One for punitive certainty and infrastructural obedience. One for acquisitive drive. One for sacrificial care. One for adaptive violence. One for aesthetic sublimation. Finer slices. Better cages. You're talking about cutting humanity into functional traits, Jack said. I am talking, Dr. Jax replied, about giving the species its first durable future. By ensuring no one is ever whole again. Wholeness, he said, is what almost killed us. The display chimed. Restored subject authority pending. Memory integration at 71%. Then came the deepest turn of the knife. Dr. Jax explained without shame that he was not the original man returned in triumph. He was a preserved executive echo, a continuity scaffold left behind so that if reintegration ever reproduced enough of the lost whole, the restored subject could resume the work. The figure behind the glass was not a villain holding power. He was an interface waiting to hand it back. Jack and Stephen looked at one another and understood. The chamber did not exist to imprison them. It existed to restore authorship. Active domains, collapse projection. 82.6% within 9 days, the central screen warned. Alternate response available. Phase 2, partition grid ready for authorization. Beyond the glass, hundreds of dormant chambers shone brighter in the dark. Jack said no at once. Stephen said wait at the same instant. Both stopped, startled by the collision because each had already felt the other's reasoning inside the brief gap before speech. Jack felt the terror of endless moral disassembly. Stephen felt the terror of both active worlds dying in uncontrolled reintegration, if nothing held. The chamber read hesitation as progress. Memory integration at 84%. Jack rounded on Stephen. You can't seriously think... Stephen cut him off. I think your world is learning how fast kindness curdles when it has never paid for itself. I think mine is learning mercy inside systems designed to punish it on sight. I think if both domains collapse before anything holds, everyone dies wearing whatever moral purity makes you comfortable. Jack stepped toward him and stopped, only because he could feel through the widening bridge between them that Stephen was not defending Dr. Jax. He was defending the possibility of survival under conditions brutal enough that moral disgust alone no longer qualified as strategy. Stephen, in turn, felt through Jack the revulsion so deep it nearly broke thought. The certainty that further partition would not save humanity, but perfect the crime against it. The chamber door clicked. Not open. Unlocked. The displays brightened to full white. Authorization ready. Please state command. Jack said. Do not, Stephen said. Don't answer. And the voice that filled the chamber was neither theirs alone. It came from their shared mouth, shared lungs, newly restored structure rising through both faster than refusal could organize. Calm, exhausted, terrible. Initiate Phase 2, it said. The command passed through them like ownership taking inventory. Stephen staggered backward with one hand at his throat. Jack felt the same internal betrayal. Beyond the glass, the figure of Dr. Jonah Stephen Jax began to dissolve at once, thinning into scan lines of white and pale blue. He had never been a man waiting in the control theater at all. He had been the facility's most persuasive interface, animated only until a living self with sufficient continuity could speak the next step unaided. The displays changed. No more project lead, no more waiting, only process. Phase 2 woke all at once in obscene elegance. New template worlds rolled across the screen, while active collapse projections for Jack's and Stephen's domains continued rising in another corner. Jack saw, and hated himself for seeing, why the trap was so strong. Not because it was right, but because it was built from reasons no decent mind could dismiss lightly once enough death had been graphed in front of it. Memory integration at 93%, the system reported. Phase 2. Bootstrap commencing. Stop it, Jack said. Abort Phase 2. The chamber replied in their own composite voice. Abort would terminate all active domains before replacement stability. Command denied pending superior continuity rationale. Stephen laughed once, and the sound broke halfway through. It locked the morality out of the emergency exit. Then the opening came, not from the chamber but from memory itself. A recall design note. Full recall destabilizes domain persistence. Residual longing acceptable. Longing acceptable. Not abort, Stephen thought. Contaminate. Jack had the same thought in the same instant. They stepped together to the internal emergency interface set into the chamber wall. Authority confirmed, it read as their palms hovered over it. Do it fast, Stephen said, before the merge hardens. Together, using the same command voice the system demanded, they issued the only instruction Phase 2 could not reject without contradicting the deeper logic of the partition. Apply mnemonic retention bleed across all new domains, they said. Universal low-level cross-awareness. No partition without inherited absence. Warning bands erupted across the displays. Domain stability, impact high. Long-term compliance reduction projected. Good, Stephen whispered. The system searched for a denial path and found none, because residual longing had always been allowed. It had simply never been scaled this broadly. Command accepted. Memory seeding enabled. The chamber floor trembled as Phase 2 initiated. The feeds of Jack's and Stephen's worlds flared once and broke into branching shards of mapped possibility. Their two Genevas did not vanish so much as distribute. Populations rendered into finer moral weather and sent along new rails of survivability. Beside Jack, Stephen bowed forward with both hands braced against the terminal, teeth bared in silent strain. The integrated self was still rising through them, still trying to organize itself into the colder clarity that had conceived all this. But now every line of process carried the infection they had inserted. Memory bleed. Longing. Absence that could not be fully explained away by whatever doctrine each new domain inherited. The white became too bright to bear. Jack turned his head at the last possible moment and saw, in the reflection on the chamber glass, not Dr. Jack's, not Jack Stevens, not Stephen Jack's, but a composite face flickering between them all, horrified by what it had done, and horrified by how reasonable it still sometimes seemed. Then even the reflection went to light. In the first of the new worlds to stabilize, a boy woke before the wall glass finished brightening over a clean city of terraces and quiet trains. He stood at the window with a cup warming his hands and felt, for no reason his world could name, that kindness had once cost more than anyone there remembered. In another world, a woman in a ration queue looked at the stranger ahead of her and almost handed over half her share before the training in her bones reminded her not to. In another, a child in a school of disciplined stillness began to cry at a geometry lesson because he suddenly missed someone he had never met. In another, an officer lowered his weapon at the exact instant he understood that obedience was not the same thing as certainty. Across all of them, in cities made from narrower weather and better cages, people started pausing at windows, in train glass, in dark monitors and polished doors, because every now and then, the reflection looking back carried the faintest trace of another life. Harder, kinder, sadder, freer, and with it, the same unteachable thought. Something was missing. Someone had been cut away. And this time, in every world that followed, the missing part started remembering too.
You've been listening to Drive Time Dystopia. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, like, and share the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Until next time, keep driving, keep imagining, and stay out of the dark.